everybody. Thanks for joining us again for another afternoon tea and truth biscuits. We are going to talk again about all the propaganda going on in the media today, and the methods that are being deployed in the current war in Ukraine. One of the horrifying patterns, of course, that I'm sure you've observed as well as I have, is the questioning over war crimes, and indeed questioning over who's responsible, casting doubt in people's minds about the different events, to a point where we're not really sure. The public starts to doubt what they're seeing in the media, and of course during conflicts there's always the fog of war of things that are revealed with time that you don't necessarily know as everything's unfolding. There are lies spinning through social media, so it can be very disorienting as an audience, as anybody, to sort of pick apart what we're seeing on our screens and on our phones and so on. So we're going to be talking about that today, and from Syria to Ukraine, we've seen questions raised over who's responsible for different acts of war. So amid all of this, researchers and journalists are obviously vital. We want to be sharing factual information and holding the people behind those violent acts responsible, bringing justice to the victims, hopefully. And finding a clear sense of what has happened and why and who's responsible is also key to resolving conflicts, of course, as well. That's why today I've invited a special guest to come and speak with us on this show. So I'm going to introduce Michael Sheldon, who has been working at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Lab, focused on Eurasia, and is now joining Bellingcat. I think you've already joined Bellingcat, haven't you? Sorry. So he has a particular background in open source intelligence research methods and verification, particularly focused on the recent events in Donbass as well. I've made some really mind-blowing investigations published over the last few months, which were really impressive, and that's why I wanted to invite you on. Michael, welcome, and glad to see you've got your cup of tea with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you tell us, please, a little bit more about yourself and your background, and how did you get into researching conflicts?
Well, so I guess I got into researching conflicts, particularly the conflict in the Donbass in I think 2017, 2016, probably. Just through, in my spare time in college, I did a couple of internships where I sort of learned practical applications of what I'd probably call creative Googling, and snooping around on social media profiles and stuff like that to sort of learn more about other countries' militaries. And so, and then from 2018 on, I worked on more specifically the conflict in the Donbass at the Atlantic Council, the DFR lab. And then, now very, very recently, I transitioned to my current role at Bellingcat.
Cool, thank you. So if anybody does want to put a question in the chat, they're more than welcomed, encouraged to do so. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We have these interviews every 2 weeks now, and I'll be continuing this show next week, probably talking again about Ukraine. Actually, that's obviously the focus on most people's minds right now. So when you first started getting into researching this, what were the main actors you were interested in researching? Because one of the important things about this kind of open source intelligence kind of work is it really helps to illuminate who's behind the influence operations and the lies and the atrocities as well that are obviously being enabled and covered up.
Yeah, when I first began, way back when, I think I was initially kind of drawn towards the militia aspect of it. I was very fascinated by the different groups and how they were organized and how they related to each other. And that's really where I came into it. And so that interest became a bit more structured. I think when I joined the DFR lab, there was a bit more of a purpose to it. And that's when I really began verifying information and analyzing open source information, sort of relating more directly to civilian harms and other sort of ceasefire violations in the conflict in the Donbass, back when there was still a thing called the Minsk agreements, which we could say, oh, well, there's a violation here, and sort of point to. That's not really the case anymore. It's much bigger than that, unfortunately. But back then, that was sort of the work, and in that way we could analyze artillery impacts through open source imagery, use a method called geolocation to sort of see where impacts landed, if they were near any military installations or military positions along the front lines. We can see how it related to the front lines, and at times it would also be possible to sort of determine a rough direction from which the artillery fire had come from.
Right. Yes, this was one thing I was really wanting to ask you about, and I'm hoping that you can explain a little bit more for the audience at home, what kind of data you're drawing on when you're doing these investigations, what that looks like, and, how reliable this is, and, what you're doing as you're trying to use this satellite imagery and verifying, and, how you get from getting that data to proving that, actually this is a war crime that did take place in this place at this time, and this person or these actors were responsible.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of challenges that you can run into when you analyze open source imagery, specifically, with geolocation. So what I think now a lot of news outlets call visual investigations. The first is, of course, is the imagery, is the footage real? And especially we saw a lot of fake footage coming out of the Russian Federation leading up to the war as sort of an attempt to justify what was to come. And so you can't always trust imagery that you see. It can be faked, and there are ways that you can attempt to verify it, primarily through geolocation, but there's also other methods, and it's not always possible. But anyway, moving on. I think so that's one hurdle that you have to get past. You have to be able to verify that the imagery is, or that the footage is sort of real, and that is usually, you can usually back that up by reverse searching the footage, and so making sure that this footage doesn't appear, or variations of this footage doesn't appear earlier, before the event was claimed to take place. And so
sometimes things are used from previous conflicts,
absolutely,
and, turned into something pretending it's like current.
Yeah, that can happen fairly frequently. It does happen fairly frequently, and often what increasingly people realize that this is something that's being done. People do check for previous instances of this footage, so they try to apply filters, they mirror it, and do other things to make it unrecognizable, at least to a computer trying to search for this same footage. So it's becoming increasingly difficult, and you have to be creative when you try to search for previous instances. If the footage is real and it's posted from a public source, some random person just posts it to their Instagram or whatever, social media profile, and you see someone else post from another angle also, then that is usually a pretty good indicator that the imagery is at the very least real. And then it's a completely different hurdle to try to interpret the imagery, and sort of try to understand what can it mean. And I think that's the biggest problem right now, is that we see imagery coming out of Ukraine, and you can see that some people say it means one thing, and then other people will interpret it in the way that aligns best with their worldview. And so that's where you need people who understand how to work with this footage.
Yeah, that's the big challenge, isn't it? Because people at home are sitting there and they're like, well, we know that, governments try to spin things, we know that, like, okay, we know Russia lies, but we also know that, we've seen propaganda before that's, come from the West. So, like, how do we know, when we're seeing all these different, images, and they're claiming one thing, these guys are claiming something else, it becomes very difficult, I think, for people to know what to trust. Do you think that it's becoming easier or harder? Because, there's all this data out there now. I mean, it's amazing what you're able to, the fact that you can search for a video and find, past videos from previous news reporting and citizen journalism and so on. The fact that we can even do this is an amazing advance. But, that also means that it's like there's such a lot circulating that, ordinary people maybe aren't necessarily able to know what to trust, are they?
It can be overwhelming, the amount of footage out there. And I think the fact that it's so out there and there's so much footage, and increasingly, open source, the kind of research that I carry out is becoming increasingly public. I think particularly the lead up to this current invasion and some of the conflicts beforehand kind of set the stage for what we're seeing now, in that people see the type of research that's been done and replicate it, and not always in a reliable way.
Yeah.
And so that's a hurdle. And that,
weaponized then? Do you see it being weaponized on the other side? Because I've seen some Russian propaganda as well that is claiming, oh, this is fake, and they are doing their own geolocation kind of analysis that, like, unless you're a person, like, if you're a person sat at home, like, you don't know the difference, really. So how do people know the difference?
It's hard to know. I mean, if you're just a regular person and not very ready to immerse yourself in really looking into the disputing claims, then it's hard to know. I think 2 weeks ago we put out an article debunking a lot of Russian claims regarding the Russian or I guess the ballistic missile strike on Kramatorsk, where there were a lot of Russian claims saying that, okay, well, this clearly points to Ukraine, and we could debunk all those claims through a variety of methods, but in the end, we end up with the kind of unsatisfying conclusion that we can't point in any one direction. We can just debunk these claims. You can. It's guesswork, and you can probably make a pretty realistic guess who actually fired the missile. But from an open source verification point of view, that's not something that you can really say at this stage.
And indeed, it's probably not the point. I mean, there are different roles for different kinds of work, and what you guys are doing is trying to look at these claims and these videos that are circulating around the internet. And that is your role, to try to find the truth for us and guide us through this, I suppose, this confusing interpretation. And
I mean, in ideal circumstances, and in many circumstances, you can point in one direction, and especially in some other circumstances where situations where Russians with rocket artillery or whatever will fire into cities, like in Kharkiv. There's been a particularly large amount of footage, some in which you can see. There was one video a month ago, I think now, where you could actually see the rocket firing in the distance, and then you could what was it, 30 seconds later, whatever the flight time was, see the rounds impacting in the city. And so there are some very clear-cut examples where you can draw that direct line. It's not necessarily beyond our ability.
I think that's important as well, is always, making sure you only say what you're able to really prove, and to the extent that you're able to prove it. And I think that's one thing that, you guys, your investigations have really done. You don't try to overclaim on this stuff. And I think, when you're sat at home as an observer reading all these different articles, one thing I do notice is actually, some of the ones that are less reliable, they are claiming a lot. They are saying, oh, this all proves that Russia is innocent or something like this, I would rather, trust, analysis that doesn't make huge claims. And, that gives me some reason to have faith in the judgment of the person not exaggerating what they have as a researcher, because I know that, there are always limits to how much we can prove with one, set of data.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of the hallmark of good open source research is transparency. And so that's what, we stretch to do in our articles, is being transparent about the information we have, what it can tell us, and sort of, what the information is essentially, and where it's from, and all of this. And so in that way, whoever's reading it can read the article and can see the original source material in many cases, and judge and see if that is a reasonable conclusion to reach. Yeah,
exactly. Have you ever found anything, like started off an investigation where you had an idea in your mind of what you were likely to find, and then you just didn't find that at all, and you had an outcome that was like completely different?
It happens. It happens from time to time. I think, in geolocations, you sometimes end up with something being in a completely different place, or it ends up looking differently than you had in mind. There was one particular geolocation that turned out to be several kilometers, probably maybe, I don't know, 20, 25 kilometers away from where I thought it was going to be. Just, trying to track a militant group through Syria at the time.
Wow. Okay.
And what I ended up doing, because it was in a particularly arid part of the country, very flat with mountains. And so that was kind of all you had to go by. It was sand and mountains. And so what I ended up doing was that I found other mountains that looked similar to the one I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And I zoomed out and saw what they looked like, very zoomed out. And then I just kind of went crazy, and looked around this entire desert instead of the area that I thought it was in, for other mountains that looked like the mountains I had seen up close. And that's sort of how I ended up finding it. But that was after many hours of trying.
Wow.
And so in that sense, it's, you can often be surprised by where things turn out to be, or what things look like from satellite imagery. Because maybe I should have started with explaining what geolocation is, or
yes, please, let's
that have been better.
That. I think we talked about satellite images and finding things.
Yeah.
That would be good if you don't mind.
Yeah, so geolocation is a process through taking on the ground imagery, or collecting on the ground imagery and picking out features within the imagery, and then cross-referencing them usually to satellite imagery, and trying to get them to match so that you can be certain that a video or image was taken in the location that you think it was taken in. And so usually that's through satellite imagery, but I think often and increasingly with Street View becoming more and more of a thing, that also becomes just through other on the ground reference images.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it depends, like you say, on the terrain, how difficult it's going to be.
Yeah.
But, let's say the investigations that you've been doing in Donbass, how long does it take to verify information from seeing a video online that, you're trying to prove it's, whether it's fake or true, or, what happened, to publishing an investigation? Because actually that time lag can be really important, because, you have a heck of a lot of circulating disinformation in that time. And I'm sure that's like very stressful when you're trying to, work as fast as you can to get the truth out there. But you also want to prove, verify it in a really clear way. So it must, if you're analyzing sand dunes, that's one thing, but like cities and ongoing conflicts must also be very, very difficult. So how long does it take? What's that usual?
It really entirely depends. Sometimes you get lucky and it takes you maybe 15 minutes to verify a location. So there's another geolocation I've been working on for 3 weeks now and haven't been able to nail down. So it really depends a lot, and there's unfortunately no straightforward answer. But it can be fairly time consuming to get all the pieces in place, depending on sort of how complex the situation is. But if it's more straightforward, if you're just verifying that this area was shelled on this day and this is sort of the damage that was visible through open source imagery, then that you can do in a day's work. That's not particularly time consuming. But if you want to go into more detail, or if it's not, or if it's in sort of an area with degraded satellite imagery, so more rural areas won't have as high quality imagery, because there's less demand for it. These are, Google and Max are commercial providers, so unfortunately we don't get equal imagery for every area. So in those situations, it can be your ability to geolocate something become degraded.
So you don't seem like the sort of person who probably shows off a lot about the value of their work and so on, but you're making a really massive contribution here, and I think it's great. I wondered if you could just sort of give us a few of like the highlights, of really important things that you found with these techniques, because I think that would help to underscore the value of the kind of approach that you're taking. Yeah.
Well, so I think a recent article I put out, and I think you retweeted. I wrote it while I was at the DFR lab. It came out slightly after I left. Was verifying footage in a 2-week time span in Kharkiv, in eastern Ukraine, and that was a pretty big undertaking. And I think I didn't take count, but I guess my editors ended up counting them up and said it was 140 geolocations or something like that we had.
Oh my God.
Which, it's over a 2-week time span. So day by day, it wasn't that bad. But that, I think, putting together and other, putting together that kind of massive overview of damage is important to sort of get a sense of just how, especially in Kharkiv and also other cities, how artillery has been really targeting an entire city and how widespread the destruction has been. And so you saw that in a fairly granular, but also limited scale at in that map that I put out in relation to that project. But you also see, these broader projects that maybe are a little less granular, but really highlight some of the more serious damage that's been carried out in civilian areas, and so Bellingcat has a map like that. The Center for Information Resilience has a map like that, and I believe also some other ones. But those maps, they're for all of Ukraine and sort of map out civilian harms throughout the country.
Excuse me. Yes, that's a really important role. And actually, excuse me, one of the people in the audience has left a question in the chat, which I think is a really great question. Ina Van, is it Wyk? Sorry if I'm saying the name wrong. Asks, will all of this information and documentation eventually be sent somewhere, like for a war crime tribunal? Sorry, go on.
I think increasingly open source information is something that will be viable in criminal tribunals, but I don't have a great sense of exactly how that would go.
One thing I would say is I think NGOs like Human Rights Watch and also just transnational organizations that look into this kind of thing, the UN and so on, they all draw on these kinds of public investigations and reporting. So whether or not you're likely to be sending all of the data from your research, I think this kind of investigation definitely contributes to these kinds of legal investigations that might well at some point in the future happen. So I think, whether or not, we see these things as connected, they definitely are. And, proving small things can actually have a massive impact on what ultimately comes out in relation to accountability.
Yeah. And I mean, yes, they might draw on that research, but they also have their own people. Open source researchers who do the same work, but in a tailored manner, so that both Human Rights Watch, I believe, and also different organs of the UN regularly hire open source researchers for this kind of work.
It makes a big difference when multiple organizations are fighting the same thing as well. That's
right,
that's one of the reasons that we know, when we do know, we have got something right, because often the public is like, well, there's this person saying this, and that's a minority view. Maybe it's like they're the dissenting opinion. Maybe the dissenting opinion is right. Well, often we are trying to find verification, and if I find one thing, it helps to know that others are finding the same thing, because hopefully the consensus will show us that actually we got it right. But I think that's another aspect of it is, we need all of these investigations to be working on this. It's not good enough that it's just Bellingcat or just Human Rights Watch that
right.
is doing this work. The more voices there are, the more people who are able to look into this and verify, the better.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, corroboration does give a sense of security in your findings, but I also would be careful with it sometimes, because you do see even on these a lot of Telegram channels I've seen have spread the same false claims and are all in agreement about whatever bullshit it is they're talking about. So I there is some value to it, especially if you can see that it's independent work. But I think this is true. Corroboration isn't verification.
You also get, foreign actors who are setting up think tanks just to put out, information that is unreliable, that is not, truthful, and it's, meant to look like it's scientifically, proven. So,
Right.
and actually companies do that as well. Private companies, we look at like the, tobacco industry over the years and things like that. Like there's lots of examples of, scientists being hired to prove something.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful. You're right. Again, that brings us back to that issue of like how you know and how you navigate this. But bringing it back to like, well, who is exaggerating, I think is a really important one. Are there any final points you'd make on like how people in the audience might judge what's reliable?
Unfortunately not. It's not something I've given too much thought. I wish I had some good advice.
Hopefully they'll keep watching this show.
Yeah. Yeah, come back for part 2.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Next week.
So next week, actually, we have a great legal mind joining us.
Maybe they can answer that.
Yes, Susie Allegre, who's going to be talking about her new book on freedom of expression, which is called Freedom to Think. So, and I actually have an article coming out this week that the audience might be interested in as well. I won't spoil the surprise yet, but if you're not signed up to my newsletter, please do, and I'll be announcing it on that. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. It's been really great meeting you. Fascinating the work that you're doing as well. And, if everybody wants to check out the article, I think I put it in the description as well. So you should, have a read of what Michael's been working on. Do you want to say a couple of little comments about what you're working on now for Bellingcat? Congrats on the new job.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm continuing to work on, documenting civilian harms, and writing on that in the conflict. So yeah, that's going to be my main thing moving forward, especially as relates to the conflict in Ukraine, or I guess the Russian war against Ukraine, as you call it. I'm sorry?
Thanks so much for doing this important work. We're going to be watching
Absolutely.
Everything that comes out, I'm sure. And maybe we'll have you back on again at some point to reflect on, how things are going. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.